Let's talk about what's actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, because the picture is bigger and messier than a single strike package on a single night. What you're watching is not an isolated flare-up. It's the latest chapter in a war that's been running since the end of February. And to understand why American F-16s and F-15Es are back over southern Iran, you have to understand everything that happened before the cameras started rolling on this particular round. Start with the timeline, because the timeline is the whole story. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran began on February 28, 2026, when American and Israeli strikes hit targets across Iran, including a strike that killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, along with a number of senior military and political officials. That is not a small detail. That is arguably the single most consequential event of the entire conflict, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Iran did not respond to that opening salvo with missiles and drones alone. It responded by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points for global energy on the planet, and that single move did more economic damage, arguably, than most of the kinetic exchanges combined. Ship traffic through the strait dropped by more than 90% in the opening weeks. Oil prices spiked. Gas in the United States climbed past $4.50 a gallon. Inflation ticked back up. Cruise lines stranded 15,000 passengers on ships that simply stopped moving through the Gulf. Countries that couldn't reroute around the strait, like Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, saw their oil revenues fall off a cliff, while countries that could reroute, like Saudi Arabia with its pipelines to the Red Sea, or countries positioned outside the choke point entirely, like the United States and notably Russia, actually saw their export revenues climb. That's worth sitting with for a second. A war centered on Iran ended up quietly benefiting American and Russian oil exporters in the near term, while squeezing nearly every Gulf economy that depended on that strait staying open. After more than 5 weeks of direct fighting, the U.S. and Iran reached a ceasefire on April 7th and 8th, and Israel was folded into that truce as well. That brought a period of relative quiet, but it didn't resolve the underlying dispute, which is control of the strait itself. On June 14th, mediators announced a 14-point memorandum of understanding designed to formally end the conflict within 60 days, and the presidents of the United States and Iran signed it on June 17th. On paper, that MOU was supposed to be the off-ramp. The U.S. lifted its naval blockade. The strait reopened. Markets exhaled. Oil prices started coming back down. Here's the problem, and it's the problem that explains literally everything that has happened since. The memorandum's language on the strait itself is vague, and the two sides read it in completely opposite ways. Article 5 says Iran will make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels, with no charge for 60 days only, from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman, and vice versa. Where Iran's negotiators and Iran's hardline parliament read that clause as confirmation that Tehran effectively controls traffic through the strait, that it gets to decide which routes ships use, and eventually, after that 60-day free window expires, that it gets to charge tolls. The United States reads the exact same sentence as describing Iran's obligation not to interfere with shipping, full stop, with no implied authority to dictate routes or collect fees. Those are not close readings of the same text. They are fundamentally incompatible interpretations, and when a peace agreement's core provision can support two opposite meanings, that agreement is a ceasefire in name only. Analysts covering the region have pointed out that Iran views control of Hormuz as a strategic asset that may now matter more to its regional leverage than its nuclear program ever did. If Iran loses the ability to dictate what happens in that strait, it loses one of the very few forms of deterrence and coercive leverage it has left. That's why Tehran has been so unwilling to let this go, even at the cost of reigniting the war. So the ceasefire held for about a week before the first real test came. Iran began trying to funnel commercial traffic toward routes closer to its own coastline, ones it could monitor and effectively control, while the U.S. pushed ships toward a route hugging Oman's coast that Washington considered outside Iranian jurisdiction. On June 25th, Iran struck the Singapore-flagged cargo ship Ever Lovely with a one-way attack drone as it exited the strait along the Omani route, the same route the U.S. had been encouraging vessels to use. The message wasn't subtle. Iran was punishing ships for using a corridor it hadn't approved. CENTCOM responded on June 26th and 27th, with strikes on Iranian missile and drone storage sites and coastal radar installations at Sirik, Jask, Keshm Island, and Bandar Abbas, hitting the infrastructure Iran uses to track shipping and queue its drone and missile forces along that stretch of coast. Iran retaliated within about a day, launching drones toward American positions in Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters, and toward Kuwait as well. American officials said the drones were intercepted or simply failed to reach their targets, and there were no U.S. casualties reported. A second commercial vessel was also hit by an unidentified projectile in the strait around the same time, and the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, which tracks threat levels for shipping in the region, raised its assessment from moderate to substantial. That late June exchange might have stayed a contained one-off flare-up if the underlying dispute over the strait had actually been resolved. It wasn't. The temporary calm that followed was less a resolution and more a pause while attention shifted to Khamenei's funeral, which took place over multiple days in early July, with his remains processed through Iraq before burial in Mashhad on July 9th. Diplomacy essentially froze during that period. American officials acknowledged no serious negotiations were expected to resume until the mourning period concluded. Then came the second, much larger wave. In the days after the funeral, Iran struck several more commercial vessels in the strait, including a Qatari LNG tanker off the coast of Oman. And by July 6th and 7th, Iranian forces had hit at least 3 ships in quick succession. The United States responded with a strike CENTCOM described as hitting over 80 targets with precision munitions in a single operation lasting roughly 4 hours, aimed at Iranian air defense systems, coastal surveillance infrastructure, surface-to-air missile positions, anti-ship cruise missile sites, and drone launch facilities. This was a significantly larger and more sustained operation than the late June strikes, and for the first time since the original ceasefire, U.S. forces also struck Iranian infrastructure beyond the immediate coastal military targets, including cruise missile strikes against 2 railway bridges in the northeast of the country. Iran's response escalated to match. Reports described missile and drone attacks reaching not just Bahrain, but Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE, essentially spreading the confrontation across the entire Gulf Cooperation Council footprint in a single weekend. Kuwaiti air defenses reported engaging hostile missile and drone attacks. Bahrain's Interior Ministry reported air raid sirens sounding across the kingdom. The IRGC claimed it shot down a U.S. surveillance drone over southern Iran. And at some point during this exchange, Iran formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed until further notice, explicitly citing what it called continued American violations of the memorandum. President Trump, speaking from Ankara during a NATO summit, said he now considered the Memorandum of Understanding to be over, and used unusually blunt language toward Iranian leadership, though he also said the following day that he didn't expect the exchange of fire to spiral into a long-term resumption of full-scale war, and left the door open to continued negotiations through his envoys. That's an important nuance because it captures the strange character of this whole phase of the conflict. Intense, repeated military exchanges happening in parallel with an insistence from Washington that this isn't really a return to all-out war, just enforcement action against a ceasefire violation. Iran's parliament speaker and lead negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, took the opposite rhetorical position, posting an image of Article 5 of the memorandum, declaring that the era of one-sided deals is over, framing the U.S. strikes themselves as the actual violation, not Iran's attempts to control shipping. By the second week of July, Trump had escalated the economic dimension of the standoff as well, announcing plans to reimpose a naval blockade on Iran and to charge a 20% toll on cargo moving through the strait, explicitly reversing the sanctions, relief, and market access that had been part of the June deal. The U.S. Treasury Department also moved to revoke a license that had allowed Iran to produce, sell, and deliver crude oil through mid-August, canceling it less than 3 weeks after it had been granted. Iran's negotiators called that reinstatement of oil sanctions a major violation of the MOU in its own right, pointing to it alongside the military strikes as evidence that Washington had abandoned the agreement first, or at least abandoned it just as thoroughly as Tehran had. Oil markets reacted about how you'd expect. Brent crude climbed above $83 a barrel after the blockade announcement. Average U.S. gas prices ticked up to roughly $3.87 a gallon, still meaningfully below the wartime peak from February and March, but rising again week over week. Shipping analytics firms tracking the strait reported that crossings had dropped by more than half compared to the prior week, once the blockade rhetoric and the renewed strikes combined to spook commercial operators. Then, in a notable reversal just this week, Trump announced he was backing away from the 20% toll idea, saying several Gulf states had reached out and offered to pursue trade and investment agreements with the United States instead of a blunt tariff mechanism, while still describing the strait as open to all traffic except Iranian shipping specifically. China's foreign ministry, meanwhile, called for a return to normal and safe passage through the strait and expressed concern over the resumption of military conflict in the Gulf, a reminder that this isn't purely a bilateral American-Iranian standoff. China is one of the largest buyers of the oil that flows through that waterway, and Beijing has its own interest in keeping the chokepoint open, regardless of who's technically supposed to be running it. So that's the state of play as of the middle of July. A memorandum of understanding that both sides claim the other has violated, a strait that's nominally reopened but running at a fraction of normal traffic, an American blockade back in place against Iranian vessels specifically, oil prices climbing again but not at February's crisis levels, and an unresolved argument over who actually gets to decide how ships move through one of the most strategically important 70 or so kilometers of water on the planet. Now let's get into the military mechanics of what these strikes actually look like, because the pattern has been fairly consistent across each round. When CENTCOM describes hitting coastal radar sites, missile and drone storage locations, and air defense systems at places like Bandar Abbas, Qeshm Island, Sarik, and Jask, what they're describing is a deliberate effort to blind and disarm Iran's ability to threaten shipping from that stretch of coastline, rather than a broader campaign against Iranian territory as a whole. Iran has spent years hardening facilities along its southern coast, in some cases building underground or semi-hardened bunkers to store drones and short-range ballistic missiles close to the strait so they can be launched with minimal warning against passing tankers. Taking out the radar sites that cue those systems is, from a purely military logic standpoint, the most efficient way to reduce the near-term threat to shipping without having to occupy or hold territory. The way a strike package like this typically comes together involves what's called suppression of enemy air defenses, or SED, as the opening phase. Aircraft like the F-16 Block 50-52 configured in the Wild Weasel role go in first specifically to find and provoke any radar systems that are still active. Those jets carry the AGM-88 HARM missile, which homes in on radar emissions, meaning that any Iranian radar operator who turns their system on to track an inbound American aircraft risks having that very signal used to guide a missile back at them. It's a genuinely dangerous mission profile, since those aircraft are deliberately exposing themselves to draw out any remaining threats before the rest of the strike package arrives. Once that layer is suppressed, heavier strike aircraft, commonly the F-15E Strike Eagle, follow in behind to deliver precision-guided munitions against the actual storage bunkers and hardened facilities, since those targets typically require larger payloads, sometimes including deep penetrating bunker buster munitions, to be effectively destroyed. Offshore, Aegis-equipped destroyers provide another layer entirely, running integrated air and missile defense that can intercept ballistic missiles with SM-3 interceptors, knock down cruise missiles and drones with other standard missiles, and use close-in weapon systems as a last line of defense against small boats or drone swarms that get close to the fleet. CENTCOM hasn't consistently named which specific aircraft flew each mission, but this general architecture, CAD first, strike aircraft second, naval air and missile defense holding the perimeter throughout, is consistent with how the U.S. has approached essentially every round of strikes in this campaign since February. It's worth being honest about what these strikes do and don't accomplish. They degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping from any specific stretch of coastline for some period of time, but Iran has repeatedly demonstrated it can reconstitute drone and missile capability at other sites, or simply wait out the immediate aftermath of a strike and resume operations once American attention shifts elsewhere. That's part of why this has become a cyclical pattern rather than a one-time knockout. Strike, temporary reduction in Iranian capability, Iranian rebuilding and repositioning, another Iranian attack on shipping, another American strike. Neither side appears able, or in the American case, currently willing to end that cycle through military force alone. Trump's own comments that he doesn't expect this to escalate into another sustained ground war, but also that there may come a point when we are no longer able to be reasonable, reflect a strategy that is closer to punitive, proportional retaliation designed to raise the cost of Iranian interference with shipping, rather than a campaign aimed at regime change or full military conquest of the strait, which is a different animal entirely, and one that Senator Lindsey Graham has floated as a hypothetical if diplomacy collapses entirely. An American assumption of direct control over the strait itself, using layered air, naval, and unmanned systems to physically guarantee passage, regardless of what Tehran says. That remains a hypothetical for now, not a stated plan, and there's no indication the Pentagon is actively building toward it in the near term. From Iran's side, the strategy looks different, but is arguably just as calculated. Iran cannot match the United States in a symmetric air war, and it knows that. What it can do is impose asymmetric costs, using relatively cheap drones and anti-ship missiles to threaten expensive commercial cargo, in a waterway that roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply moves through. That gives Tehran leverage disproportionate to its actual military strength. Every tanker hit, even superficially, drives up war risk insurance premiums, spooks shipping companies into rerouting, and puts upward pressure on global energy prices, all of which creates political pressure on Washington and on the Gulf states that depend on that traffic. Iran's insistence on controlling routing through the strait and eventually collecting tolls once the free passage window in the MOU expired is really an attempt to convert a temporary wartime capability, the ability to threaten shipping, into a permanent institutionalized source of revenue and geopolitical leverage. One Iranian advisor close to the negotiating team put it about as bluntly as it can be put, saying that Iran would either hold onto control of the strait or become martyrs for it, and that extracting revenue from the waterway is ultimately subordinate to the larger goal of controlling it outright. That's not the language of a government looking for a quiet, technical dispute over shipping lanes. That's the language of a government that sees this as an existential test of whether it retains any meaningful leverage at all in the post-ceasefire landscape. It's also worth noting that Iran's public statements after each round of strikes tend to follow a consistent rhetorical pattern, characterizing American and, where relevant, Israeli action as violations of the ceasefire or the memorandum, framing Iran's own strikes on shipping and retaliatory attacks on U.S.-linked facilities in the Gulf states as a proportional response to those violations, and generally trying to position Tehran as the aggrieved party responding to bad faith, rather than the initiator of hostilities. The United States, for its part, consistently frames its strikes as direct responses to specific, identifiable Iranian attacks on commercial vessels, and CENTCOM has been fairly disciplined about publicly tying each round of American strikes to a specific triggering incident, whether that's the ever-lovely, the tanker Kiku, or the wave of attacks on Qatari and Saudi vessels in early July. Both sides are, in effect, running a parallel information campaign alongside the kinetic one, each trying to establish itself publicly as the party observing the ceasefire while the other one breaks it. That matters because international opinion, oil markets, and the willingness of Gulf states to keep hosting American forces are all downstream of whichever narrative gains more traction. The economic dimension of this deserves its own honest look, because it's arguably driving more of the day-to-day decision-making than the military exchanges themselves. The 2026 disruption to the Strait of Hormuz has already reshaped global energy trade in ways that will likely outlast the conflict itself. The New York Times analysis comparing trade flows since the war began found that the United States and Russia were the biggest financial beneficiaries of the disruption, gaining tens of billions of dollars in additional export revenue as buyers scrambled for alternative sources outside the chokepoint, while nearly every Gulf state that depends on the strait for its own exports saw revenue declines, with the partial exception of countries like Saudi Arabia and Oman that have some ability to route around it. Beyond oil, the conflict has rippled into agriculture, aluminum production, since Bahrain hosts one of the world's largest aluminum smelters and has had to cut output, and even helium supply chains, since a meaningful share of global helium production runs through facilities exposed to the same disruption. None of that is abstract for ordinary consumers. It shows up as higher prices at the pump, more expensive shipping costs baked into consumer goods, and general inflationary pressure that has already become a live political issue in the United States, to the point that domestic frustration with sustained high gas prices was cited by Trump himself as one of the practical constraints on how long a full-scale war against Iran could realistically be sustained. There's also a domestic political dimension worth mentioning briefly, since it shapes what happens next. In the days surrounding this latest escalation, Senate Democrats blocked a $1 trillion defense bill specifically in protest over the administration's handling of the Iran war, a sign that even within the United States, there is no unified consensus about how far this confrontation should go or how it should be funded and authorized going forward. That kind of domestic political friction tends to act as a natural brake on open-ended military campaigns, and it's part of why an outright American seizure of the strait, the scenario Senator Graham floated, remains a much bigger political lift than another round of targeted strikes against radar sites and drone bunkers. Zooming out to the wider region and the wider world, this conflict isn't happening in isolation. In Lebanon, Israeli strikes have continued hitting targets like the southern town of Nabatieh al-Fawqa, even after Israel signed an agreement related to troop withdrawal from parts of the country, which is itself a sore point tied into the broader Middle East memorandum, since that agreement explicitly called for a region-wide ceasefire and preservation of Lebanese sovereignty and territorial integrity, terms Israel's continued strikes arguably sit uneasily against. Iran's allies and the broader informational environment in the region treat developments in Lebanon and developments in the Strait as connected pieces of the same larger de-escalation that hasn't quite happened. Meanwhile, further afield, Ukraine has continued and in some ways intensified its drone campaign against Russian military-industrial targets, including missile production facilities around Moscow, adding pressure on Russian logistics, even as global attention is pulled toward the Gulf. And China has continued a slow, deliberate expansion of its own naval reach, extending the operational endurance of its aircraft carrier deployments month over month, even though it remains years behind the United States Navy in the logistics needed to sustain truly indefinite carrier operations far from home. None of these threads are directly caused by the Hormuz standoff, but they're all playing out on the same global stage at the same time, competing for the same finite bandwidth of diplomatic and military attention from Washington, and in China's case, watching very closely how a chokepoint crisis like this one gets managed, since Beijing has its own chokepoint anxieties in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea that make the Hormuz precedent worth studying. So where does this actually go from here? There are really three broad paths. The first is a genuine renegotiation of the ambiguous language in Article 5 of the memorandum, something specific and unambiguous about who controls routing and who, if anyone, is entitled to collect fees, brokered probably through Oman and Qatar, who have already been directly engaged in shuttle diplomacy on exactly this question. That's the outcome nearly everyone involved says they'd prefer, at least rhetorically, but it requires both sides to accept a version of the Strait's status that neither has been willing to fully accept so far. The second path is a continuation of the current cyclical pattern: periodic Iranian attacks on shipping, periodic American retaliatory strikes, oil prices oscillating up and down with each round without anyone actually declaring the ceasefire dead or attempting a decisive military resolution. Given how the last several weeks have actually played out, that middle path, messy, unresolved, expensive, but short of full-scale war, is probably the most likely near-term trajectory, especially given that Trump has repeatedly paired tough rhetoric with statements that he doesn't want this to become a prolonged conflict, and given the domestic political friction already visible in Washington over defense spending tied to the war. The third path is the more dramatic one: a genuine American attempt to physically guarantee open passage through the strait using persistent naval, air, and unmanned systems, effectively taking direct control away from Iran rather than continuing to punish Iran after the fact for interfering with it. That remains for now a possibility raised in political rhetoric rather than a policy actually in motion. And it would represent a substantial escalation in scope, cost, and risk compared to everything that's happened so far. What's clear is that the underlying dispute, who controls one of the world's most important shipping corridors, was never actually resolved by the ceasefire or the memorandum that followed it. Those agreements bought time and reduced the intensity of direct combat, but they papered over a disagreement that both governments have very good reasons to care about intensely. For Iran, control of the strait is close to the last significant form of leverage it retains after losing its supreme leader and absorbing months of direct military strikes. For the United States and its Gulf partners, an Iranian toll booth on global energy trade is something Washington has signaled consistently across multiple administrations' worth of Middle East policy it is simply not willing to accept. Until one side genuinely changes its position on that core question rather than just its rhetoric, expect more nights like the one that footage came from. American strike packages going in against coastal radar and drone storage sites, Iranian drones and missiles answering back at Gulf targets within a day or two, oil markets flinching each time, and a ceasefire that both governments keep insisting is intact while acting, in practice, like it barely survived the summer.